Beethoven in his core is, in my view, a composer of light. His music, by and large, is uplifting and life-affirming. But in few of his works, he addressed the darkness with a mastery just as complete, particularly in the cycle of sonatas, the Moonlight, the Pathétique, and perhaps most of all the Appassionata. Sonata number 23 in F minor, opus 57. That those three sonatas are undoubtedly among the most popular works he's ever written, I think is some kind of proof of the allure, inescapable attraction that these dark landscapes exert on us. And perhaps it is also proof of Beethoven's greatness as, on one hand, a dramaturg, of knowing how to construct these dark narratives in a way that grip us from the first moment, but also to his profound and relatable humanity. The reason that we so willingly go along with him on these white-knuckle rides is that we feel that he has gone through the same pain and the same horror and the same darkness that this music depicts, and that he feels the same things as we do, perhaps even more strongly than we do. And therefore we willingly lower our defenses and go along with him. The tension here in the Appassionata is tangible, palpable from the very first. Out of nowhere, out of a silence, out of nothing comes out this austere, barren unison of the two hands. This is nothing but an arpeggio, a broken chord. And it is only Beethoven's genius that could transform this empty material into a device of incredible psychological and atmospheric power. The hands start 2 octaves apart, not 1 octave, but a little bit farther. And this introduces a motif which Beethoven will explore throughout the sonata, the tension and distance between the two hands, and later on seeing how far he could stretch that distance, getting to a point where the right hand plays at the very top of the keyboard and the left hand at the very bottom of the keyboard, exacerbating this feeling of barrenness and a great expanse of empty space. So emptiness, hollowness is one of the motifs, atmospheric devices which he uses in this opening and throughout the sonata. This trill, in my opinion, it is like a shimmering shiver. It is more a psychological device of us shivering in response to this than any kind of actual technical trill. And right away after this, he repeats this first phrase half a tone higher. This half step up, so from the main chord to the next one and then back, is another device which he will explore throughout the sonata. This harmony, the so-called Neapolitan chord, was normally one of the darkest harmonies available in any minor key. And you can probably feel this when we go from one to another. Compare it with, which is a lot more normal. This is so heavy and laden with weight, and it wants to go back to the darkness of the opening. And then, because this is Beethoven and everything becomes a motif as soon as it is introduced, he takes the first notes of these two phrases, so C, and the D flat, So these two notes, and he makes them into a motive of its own. So here we have two things. First, the famous fate knocking on the door rhythm, which he used many times, most famously in, but also in a completely different disguise. So in its core it is nothing but a sequence of 4 notes, 3 that are an upbeat leading to the 4th. But here, this of course is not the bright and nice way he uses it in the 4th concerto, but much closer to the darkness of the 5th symphony, just as of yet, not yet so explosive. So it is like, I would say, not a premonition of something to come, but almost a promise that an explosion will come. The dialogue between the two hands, and once again the span grows, the distance between the two hands. And then finally the explosion comes. Cascade of semiquavers rolling down the keyboard. And then an even bigger explosion. And that interaction between moments of static quietness, where nothing moves and everything is tense, awaiting the explosion, and then the moments of explosion, will be the story of the entire first movement. There are very few moments of real calm, and when they come, they are short-lived. We are mostly between these two extremes. Either it is boiling hot and upon us and we can barely resist it, or it is static and not moving and we are hunched and tense in anticipation of the explosion. Another motif which he introduced here like forlorn cries. Those being an augmentation of the And then comes one of the few aisles of calm, the second subject. Interestingly, the material is once again an arpeggio, and it is effectively an inversion of this. This goes, and this goes up and down. So again, drawing, as was his habit, drawing every ounce of potential musical and melodic potential from every idea which he introduces. But as I said, those aisles of calms are really short-lived, and we then go to one of these frozen moments. This is like something creepy crawling down the wall. And an explosion. So that I could continue like this through the entire movement, this alternation between frozen moments and explosions. And one of the greatest moments in the entire movement comes at the end of the development. There was a big build-up, and it was followed by a long explosion. fight between the D flat and the C. So the same two notes that started. The sonata here, it's a real clash. And now something incredible happens. He repeats the entire opening, but over a pulsating bass line. Why is this so extraordinary? Apart from the fact that as a psychological device of tension and atmosphere it is incredibly strong, he completely subverts one of the very basic tenets of the sonata form. And the sonata form, in its basic incarnation, there are themes introduced in the exposition, in the home key, then we leave the home key, especially in the development, we go explore other areas. It's an area of instability. The two melodies which we had in the beginning, they are developed, varied, clashed, and then we have a wonderful moment of homecoming where we go back to the home key and we go back to the opening melody. And this is a moment of warmth, of, I think homecoming is the right word, because this is a feeling that we have traveled far and now we are in a safe place once again. So what he does here, we are indeed in our beginning, so we go back to the melody that we had at the very beginning, but there is nothing comforting or warm or welcoming here. If anything, it feels even more dangerous, even more unstable, even more threatening. So he took this idea of when we get to the reprise we will feel safe again, and he completely drags the carpet from under our feet so that we feel the least at ease that we did in the entire movement. And of course the fact that now the right hand has to play on its own something which was previously written for two hands, and we have an extra device that also, it almost shows us this material in a new light. It is almost like in a mystery movie when there are flashbacks to something that we saw early on, but now, having seen other things and understanding more what's going on, we realize with a shudder that what we thought it was actually is something quite different. I find this incredibly powerful. And then after the reprise ends, there is a big coda, and it is made from the same elements that we discussed before. First, there's a moment of static lack of motion, with the hands being as far apart as possible. Then later there's a big build-up, and then an explosion and a really driven fortissimo passage with the bass advancing the line. And so on. It becomes faster and faster in the units. First it is 2 bars for each harmony, then 1 bar, then half a bar, then there are 4 harmonies per bar. And after this avalanche of sound, we have our motive, the final appearances. And here there is another section to the coda, which is written faster, and it starts. So this was our motive in major, here transformed into a minor key and gaining a really pleading, imploring character. battle between the hands. This uses the same motive as before, but just without the first note, so that it's groups of three. Final imploring bar. Desperate, and then it all collapses. And the image I have here is the scene is completely covered with heavy snow. Everything is muffled. There is almost no sound. And the snow, I think my association with it, because this idea of a tremolo surround and the melodies above and below it was used later by Liszt in an etude which he called a snowstorm. And the snowstorm is in the middle of the etude, but it starts and ends with the same. And the idea that the tremolo is the musical depiction of the wall falling snow, and the melody is just barely discernible through it above and below. And after those 10 minutes that are among the most intense that Beethoven has ever written, he, being a master performer, senses his audience and probably understood that they would not be able to take any more at this point. And in the second movement, he does give us a proper moment of respite. It is a theme and variations, and the theme has an interesting combination. It starts like a chorale, but then towards the end of each phrase, he introduces a march-like rhythm in the left hand. And this combination of a very steady sequence of chords in the chorale and then the very poised rhythm in the left hand is unique, in my opinion. I've not encountered a similar combination neither in Beethoven's works nor anywhere else. As you could probably hear, it starts quite low in the keyboard. It has the richness and glow of an oil painting, in my opinion, an old oil painting with slightly darkened colors as we see it today. And then the sequence of variations will gradually introduce more movement and life into the theme, and also at the same time bring it higher and higher up the keyboard. So the first variation has the melody corresponding with a syncopated left hand. It's a very interesting use of syncopation, because normally it should be that the main voice is long and the syncopated voice is short. But he does the exact opposite, as he often wants to do, the opposite of what you would expect. And here this is short, and all the weight and the long line is in the syncopated left hand. Which of course makes it much more interesting than the expected. Then the second variation goes higher up the keyboard. The main melody is in the left hand, it's like a cello. And the right hand plays a variation, a figuration form of the melody. one octave higher from the theme, and the movement now is in semiquavers. And then the last variation will go even higher, one and sometimes 1.5 more octaves, and the movement will be twice as fast in demi-semiquavers. The movement like a merrily bubbling brook, the sound so much lighter and brighter than this. And then this silver tone, like bells or like the reflection of sunshine on the water in the little specular highlights. And then after this variation reaches a climax, going almost as high as he could. His highest note at the time was this C, so he almost reaches that high note. We, in 2 bars, descend the entire distance that we made throughout the movement. Final closing variation, which matches the first half of the phrase as it was in the beginning, with a more personal second half. And then, as this variation is about to finish, then another extraordinary thing happens. And it should have gone here. But instead, it goes into the most uncertain questioning chord imaginable, the double diminished. There is a fermata, we should wait on it. And then the same chord is repeated fortissimo. And we immediately plunge into the finale. And all the respite that we had is deleted in just a few bars. The finale, for me, is the tensest movement which Beethoven has ever written. It is a perpetuum mobile, an endless motion in semiquavers, and the feeling of danger, the feeling of impending disaster is so strong that even as a performer, you are constantly in danger of being overwhelmed. There's a feeling right up to the coda that these waves are upon us and we can barely keep them at arm's length. And then you will see what happens in the coda itself. So this diminished chord is repeated. And this harmony stays for a very long time. We don't have the basic harmony yet. Here he introduces the motion in semiquavers. And here we will have what is the melody of this movement. So that's not a melody at all, it is a figuration. Which is, interestingly, the entire movement is to be played allegro ma non troppo, so fast but not too much. So he does not want it to be as fast as possible, not a technical bravura example, but something that is about atmosphere and this feeling of darkness. I imagine it as a hushed nightly landscape, and above these figurations we will want to have these forlorn calling voices. It is extremely atmospheric. It is quite a difficult movement to play. But I think the biggest challenge for a performer here is not necessarily just the technical bit of playing all the notes and doing the balance of the voicing, but how to create the atmosphere, how to maintain the tempo in such a way that the feeling of dread is always there. It is sometimes intensified, sometimes a little bit less, but it is constantly present. Beethoven usually writes rondo forms in his finale, so a refrain which is repeated many times with different episodes in between. But here, to support the much darker and more serious narrative which he has in this movement, he chooses also the more serious sonata form. So we will have once again have a development and a reprise. And he does something really interesting with form. The standard approach was to repeat the exposition twice, and then the development and the reprise would be played once. In Mozart's time, the development and the reprise would also be repeated, so that the entire first movement would effectively be played twice. But by the time Beethoven was writing his sonatas, this second repeat of the development and the reprise was falling increasingly out of favor. He only wrote it in two of his earliest sonatas, number 1 and 2. And even there, today, we usually do not perform that repeat, because by the time you get to the end of the reprise, to go back to the development feels somehow unconvincing. So much has passed that to go back to this unstable situation in the development, you really need to believe strongly that it can work from a narrative and psychological point of view. But here, he does exactly that. He asks not to repeat the first half, or the first part, and then he repeats the development and the reprise, and to make sure that the performer does not think it is a mistake, he asks to be written in the score that the second part should be played due volte, twice, 2 times. And I think there is a specific reason why he wants to do that, and the reason is staving off the coda. I mentioned that there is a feeling of impending disaster, and the disaster will come in the end in the coda. And Beethoven probably knows that it will come, and the entire movement is geared towards it. But this repeat of the development and the reprise in the finale of the Appassionata is an attempt, a narrative attempt, to delay the inevitable. We all know that it will happen, but we will try to have another 2-3 minutes in which that does not happen yet. And before I show that disaster, I also wanted to show the transition from the development to the reprise, because this double diminished chord, which he uses as the transition between the second movement and the finale, is playing a big role. As again, Beethoven introduces an idea and then he develops it to make it into a real motive. So in the end of the development, so this is all the same chord. I should perhaps explain that the interesting thing about the double diminished chord, so it is a sequence of 3 minor thirds, that it is symmetric, and it is the same if you take the bottom note and put it an octave higher, you will get the same chord. So I take this note, put it above, and I get this chord. Then I take the bottom note, put it above, and again, and we get back to the original chord with which we started. So this chord can be played throughout the entire keyboard. And it is always the same. And this fact that this chord is always the same was used by many composers to strong effect. Biggest of them was Liszt. For Liszt, the double diminished chord was his main way of changing directions. So he would take this chord, start from bass of E, then play various passages with this chord, finish with the chord in this form on the bass of B flat, and then exit this highway at that junction and continue with a bass of B flat. So it would be his way of modulating. For Beethoven here, it is a completely different reason for using this chord. I think he uses it here for the inherent sense of tension in it. It is highly unresolved. There is not a stable interval inside. It wants to go somewhere, and every note of it wants to go somewhere. Not one of them will remain in the resolved chords. So here he does the same thing. He plays up and down the keyboard using this double diminished chord. And here, the most atmospheric moment. So once again, he uses the same chord almost to the heights and depths of the keyboard. So he had just one note higher and one note lower. And it is not a very expressive thing in itself just to play an arpeggio, but he manages through the atmospheric build-up and the pianissimo and the pedal to make it into something incredibly atmospheric. There's once again this feeling of static, unmoving tension or anticipation or expectation of something to come, and then it does resolve it. And we go into the reprise. That is a moment that in performance is always, there's a lot of theater in it. It's waiting on these pauses. And being as immovable as possible here to reinforce this feeling of staticness. And then finally, after the second time we play the development and the reprise, the coda cannot be prevented any longer. You cannot go for the third time. So he must go on and reach the inevitable goal. So it starts with some kind of dance, quite desperate, very grounded. This is the lowest chord he has on his keyboard. And if everything before was constant movement, here these cuts and divisions is a stark contrast to what we had before. It is also incredibly catchy. This is one of the moments that we usually remember the strongest. And then he repeats it twice, and there's a second time when it goes into the major key, so I think we might be able to escape. But no. And from there on, it is wave upon wave of passages, semiquavers. Really overcoming us completely. And you could probably hear, and this is something I should have mentioned before, that like he did in the first movement, moving from the bass chord half a step up, he does it also in the finale. And then, so the same chord plays an important role in both the first movement and the finale. And it ends with a complete crash and disaster. It is one of very few pieces by Beethoven that do end badly, that end in tragedy and collapse. The great British musicologist Tovey called it a rush deathwards, which I think is a very, very poetic and evocative expression. And in my opinion, no other sonata can compete with the Sonata in sheer, dramatic, gripping, unforgettable power.
you.